in the 20th century, and I don't think there's many people who would argue with that. Nelson Riddle was born in 1921. He died in 1985, and during that time he had a most interesting and turbulent career, and of course he worked with many of the greats. I suppose everybody would know that he worked with Frank Sinatra because many of his greatest, Frank Sinatra's greatest albums were arranged by Nelson Riddle. The reason for this program is because early in August, Christopher and Rosemary Riddle, two of his children, came into Dublin because they were taking part in a large concert of Riddle's music, which took place in the National Concert Hall with the RTE Concert Orchestra, and I believe that was a great success. Unfortunately, I couldn't be at it, but I was able to entice Christopher and Rosemary into the studio to talk about their father. But there were no no-go areas, and I had previously ascertained from both Christopher and Rosemary as to whether there would be anything that we didn't want to talk about, or rather that they wouldn't want to talk about, and they said no, they were quite happy to talk about it. They had cooperated with Peter Levinson, who wrote a book which was entitled September in the Rain, which was the life story of Nelson Riddle. So sit back and enjoy the next hour in the company of myself, with Christopher and Rosemary Riddle in the studio, and of course lots and lots of Nelson Riddle's music. Well, you're certainly not going to find too many people arguing with me if I say that Nelson Riddle was probably the greatest musical arranger in the popular field in America for the whole of the 20th century, and I'm certainly not going to have any argument from his two children who are sitting here. 2 of 7, right?
Yes,
7
children.
Yeah, okay.
6 survivors.
So anyway, let's just talk a bit about your dad, because you're both really dedicated to sort of making his work survive. And members of Tommy Dorsey, right?
Buddy was about 17 years old in 1944 when Dad was on the band, and when the band came west to play the West Coast, that's where Nelson Riddle became aware of Doreen Moran, who was going to become his wife, and the mother of his 7 children.
Indeed, indeed. I'm going to take you into sort of bad times now a bit, because the next track we've got coming up is with Rosemary Clooney, and of course there was a well-publicised, well, I don't know whether it was well-publicised at the time, but it's certainly well-publicised subsequently, the affair that existed between Rosemary and Nelson during the time she was doing her TV show. I interviewed Rosemary some years ago, and she'd just produced an album with Nelson Riddle arrangements, and they had to be reconstructed by her then musical director John Otto, because they did, according to her, they didn't exist. That is, they had been thrown in the bin.
Right.
Now, I wondered whether, in fact, the reality was that they were being owned by your stepmother, who comes across as the wicked stepmother in every sense, and I wondered whether, in fact, she was telling me the truth, whether, in fact, that the arrangements existed, but they weren't available.
There's some... I think it's in that case it's really true that they couldn't come up with the paperwork, but there were a lot of things that our stepmother refused to share with anyone, and there had to have been boxes of music. Now all that is at the University of Arizona, because she then, after she passed away, gave all of that to University of Arizona. But these arrangements transcribed from the television show that you're talking about, that she did for the album dedicated to Nelson, didn't seem to exist even in that. So it's very possibly true that they just, the paper didn't exist, but John Otto did an amazing transcription.
A beautiful job, yeah.
Yes, he's good at it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess from your point of view, from the kids' point of view, this was a critical moment in your life, because your mother and father's marriage broke down, and but your mother was alcoholic, I think, was she, or she was?
Yes, after our sister Lenora died, when she was only 6.5 months old, and she was really came in the middle after our sister Bettina. It crushed our parents severely, and all of the work that they had, striven to achieve, the dad's success. Mom was right there at the beginning, making sure he made the right contacts. She was his copyist. There's all these stories about, she didn't really know music. So all of that work that she had done, it's like you reach this pivotal, this crescendo of dad's
pulled the rug out from under her.
And then Lenora died, and they couldn't handle they couldn't deal with or heal themselves, let alone each other or be there for each other. And it was a very vulnerable point, and Dad and Rosemary were working together, and they fell into, and Rosemary was dealing with Jose, so
exactly,
it was both vulnerable people at that point.
Yeah, I should explain that's Jose Ferrer we're talking about, the Spanish
Remember, there's a component here that we're not mentioning, and that is that Dad was an only child. He was an only child, and he was really like a little, I believe his mother used to dress him in short pants, and he had long curly hair and this kind of thing, and she was grooming him. She was from Alsace-Lorraine, my father's mother, and she was determined that Nelson Riddle Jr. was going to make something. They were going to make something out of him because she wasn't too happy with Nelson Riddle Sr. He hadn't excelled at anything. He was a fine artist, my father's father, but they fell on very hard times in the Depression, and there just wasn't two nickels to rub together. But Dad used to say to me, as an aside, that sometimes I just feel like the eighth kid.
Right.
Yeah, with our whole family.
Yeah,
so.
Right, okay.
At least his math was good anyway.
Yeah, okay.
And so when that happened, it just really was put on, the road to destruction, their marriage. And then Mom had a nervous breakdown and she began to drink. And,
after she lost Lenora.
It was after Lenora.
Rosemary was only, about 9 years old, and Mom went into labor at the house in Malibu, and there was no time to get her to the hospital, so Mom sent Rosemary down to the linen closet to get some sheets, and Mom gave birth to Lenora Celeste Riddle right there in the kitchen.
Yeah, the neighbor lady came in, and it was just... very quick, and Lenora was a very healthy baby until she was around 6 months old, and she...
Yeah, very tragic story.
Very tragic.
And anyway, we'll try not to cast a gloom over the next track, because this is Rosemary Clooney. The musical relationship was very serendipitous.
Oh, yeah, she was superb.
So let's listen to that one.
I get along without you.
Yeah, after it strikes me that after listening to Sea of Dreams and Cross Country Suite and what we just heard Rosemary Clooney sing, it strikes me as to the huge versatility that Nelson Riddle had. Everything from Ravel, Debussy, Jacques Ibert, Frederick Delius, to big bands, jazz. His talent knew no.
He had no boundaries.
No,
that's right. We're going to go into a nice warm area now, and an area which very familiar to Jazz Alley listeners, of course, which is the Gershwin Songbook, one of the great masterpieces of popular music. I think an incredible piece of work, all of which was arranged by Nelson Riddle. We were talking there while that music was playing, and Rosemary was telling me that Nelson unfortunately took a big chunk of money up front but didn't keep any royalties for that. That must be slightly irritating to the family, to say the least of it.
Well, it is in some ways, and I'm the one who administers the music now, and tries to keep track of what's happening, what contracts I needed to search for. But honestly, Dad's relationship with Ella surpasses monetary value, and I am so happy that so many of his collaborations with Ella are still out. And
you
you
yourself were a great friend of Ella's.
Yes,
yeah. She called you Dimples?
Yes, she called me Dimples, and
okay.
we would see each other in the studio, and she was very approachable. Frank Sinatra was fabulous, but he wasn't someone you were just going to walk up to in the recording studio. Ella was different. Nat was different. And Linda Ronstadt has been, very sweet. Very.
We'll come on to her later. But
yes.
In terms of Ella, this. How did this come about? How did this contract to do this work with Ella? Had he worked with her before? He hadn't, I don't think.
No, this was through Norman Grant.
Norman Granz, I guess it was his idea.
Yeah.
Amazing impresario.
He was quite incredible impresario. Actually, the more
I
you
would-
learn about
I
him, the
know.
more.
He'd be in the studio, and he looked like he'd just come off the tennis court because he had his tennis gear on, and he had just come off the tennis court. He was an avid tennis player.
Well, he was like the Gershwins then, wasn't he?
Yes,
They were,
yes.
well, not Ira, but George
yeah.
was a keen tennis player.
The-
Yeah.
I asked my father, our father, I'm sorry, I
okay.
keep thinking,
It's yours
I'm
as
not
well.
ignoring the fact that my sister's sitting here.
No.
My sister Rosemary used to bounce things off my head
Yes,
when I
I
was
did.
younger. And I still have it on,
That's because you
fortunately.
teased me.
I teased her. I did
Okay.
tease. I earned it.
Okay.
But in any case, I asked our father once about the Gershwin songbook. I said, "How did you decide?" I believe it comprises 60 selections. I believe.
Yeah,
and I said, "How did it originally was 5 long playing albums, vinyls, and it came in a deluxe. You could get a deluxe one that came in a little carrying case made out of wood. Had a driftwood color." In any case, I asked him, how did you decide which selections from the Gershwin catalog that you were going to do with Ella? And he said that was the easy part. The hard part was what we weren't going to do.
Never surpassed, in my opinion, the Gershwin songbook. Ella Fitzgerald there with, of course, Nelson Riddle arrangement. Magnificent. The way he moves from that kind of slush, stringy thing into that extraordinary jazz ending, which is colossal stuff.
Yeah.
Let's just move forward now, because obviously that was a real boost to the career at the time, but then came along the Beatles, and then came along rock
and roll.
So arrangers with big bands and big orchestras kind of didn't find it that easy to get work. So there must have been a decline there in his work rate.
Well, Dad hit a very dry period in the latter part of the 70s, and it continued into the early 1980s. And then something magical happened. I was listening to the radio one day, as was my wont. I listened to the news radio in Los Angeles called KNX. It's a CBS affiliate. And the entertainment segment comes on where they report about the latest movies and what have you. And the guy mentions that Linda Ronstadt earned $15 million the previous year in record royalties alone.
So that was like 1981?
That was about 1983, I believe.
Think how much that is in today's money.
Sometime near to this going into one ear, my father calls me and he says, "Guess who I just talked to?" And I can't imagine. He said, "Linda Ronstadt." I said, "What did she want?" He said, "She'd like me to write her an arrangement for the tune, 'I Guess I'll Hang My Tears Out to Dry.'" Now, I had talked to my father about these people approaching him for arrangements, 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever, and I said, "Dad, they're just going to take these things and use them and use them and use them. You're going to get paid once, and that'll be the end of it." I said, you tell them that you will be happy to do a package for them and record it, an album, in other words. And fortunately, he listened to me, I think, because the next thing you knew, we were going to do an album called What's New. So maybe I had something to do with it. I don't claim that I do, but that's.
you did.
But Linda will always be near to our families and dear to our family's heart because she gave Dad a second chance. She was his renaissance.
And a wonderful piece of music, pieces of music resulted, which certainly did her no harm either.
No.
I mean, they propelled her forward. They gave her a much broader base than she'd previously had.
She will still tell me that their work was not done, and she was bereft when Dad passed so quickly, so untimely.
Yeah, of course. I mean, he died just 2 years.
64,
And
at the age of 64.
At the age of 64.
In 1985.
That strikes fear into my heart. Okay, let's listen to When I Fall in Love. Well, we're coming to the end of our hour, I'm afraid. So let's just move into another little sad moment, because we talked earlier about Frank Sinatra and the relationships they had, and of course the incredible music that they produced together. But that didn't persist. They fell out in some way.
Yes, there was a rift developed between them in 1978. My father was being honored at a dinner at the Century Plaza Hotel in Los Angeles, and Frank had been approached to compare the evening. And they moved the date 4 times to accommodate Frank's schedule, and Frank finally wound up sending his lawyer, Mickey Rudin, that night. And my father was absolutely destroyed, and he sat there with this big crystal bowl in his lap that they'd presented him with for his tribute, and he said, "I'll never work for that man again." And then in December of 1984, Dad told me the phone rang one morning, and very early in the morning, and it was Frank on the other end. Frank was in Washington, D.C., and Ronald Reagan was going to be inaugurated for the second time in January of 1985, and would Dad like to be music director and reprise what he had done with Frank on the JFK inauguration back in 1961. And my father accepted. And actually, there's a funny little anecdote. Frank at one point noticed that it was only 6 o'clock in the morning in Los Angeles, and it was 9 o'clock in the morning in Washington, D.C. So he apologized. He said, "Nelson, I didn't take the time consideration into, I didn't consider the time difference. I'm sorry if I woke you up." And Dad said, "That's okay, Frank. I had to get up to answer the phone anyway." Frank didn't think that was funny. I said, "What did he say to that?" And he said, "There was just a silence." So he didn't think that was funny.
Oh,
so in any case, they did get together and worked on the together. Dad as music director on Ronald Reagan's inauguration in 1985. And afterwards, Dad and I went to a big party that Frank was throwing at the Madison Hotel. And Frank nailed my father the minute he walked in, and they were cheek to cheek for 45 minutes at least. Barbara's knocking on Frank's door and saying, Frank, he's waving her off. And I asked Dad afterwards, I said, "What'd you talk about?" And he said, "Well, we talked about old times, and we're going to work together. We're going to do a 3-record album of standards, none of which we've ever..." Dad hated reheating old things, and that's what Frank made him do when he came over to Reprise in 1962, reheat things that he'd done for Capitol. So these were all going to be standards that none of them they hadn't recorded before. Unfortunately, Dad didn't live it out.
No, it's very sad. Let's listen to some of the great Sinatra. This is "I've Got You Under My Skin." I think it's been fascinating listening to you guys and reliving some of those times. So I'm sure our listeners agree with me. But I just want to thank you both very much for coming in and spending time with us. And
it's a pleasure.
Sharing memories
Wonderful.
of your dad. What it must be great to actually live in that heritage. So
Yes, it is.
thank you for coming in.
Okay.
Thank you.
And that's all for tonight. So if you have been, thanks for listening.